Serious. What's the most creepy, unlikely, or unexplainable occurrence to ever happen to you or someone you know that is not fictional? Part 2. Please like and subscribe to support this channel. One time I was sleeping downstairs at my grandparents' house. They have a pretty old, big-ish house out in the country. I was just laying there, peacefully reading Reddit, and then I start hearing what sounds like really slow footsteps. Slow as in like one step per few seconds. Eventually, it sounds like there is someone breathing in the kitchen. I was in the living room which was attached to the kitchen. This is when I started actually getting pretty creeped out by the whole thing. So, I was positive I heard some sort of breathing going on in the kitchen. Then the footsteps start again. Of course, me being the little bitch I am, I was turned facing the back of the couch, so I wouldn't be able to see my killer, with my blanket almost up to my eyes. After a minute or so, I swore I heard breathing coming from basically directly next to my head. I wasn't moving though, I just closed my eyes and hoped that I wouldn't piss myself. I came down in the morning and asked my dad and brother if either were walking around last night, and they both said they weren't. At 14 years old, I woke up from a dead sleep and said out loud, "My first child will be a boy." Right after that, I shook my head and asked myself, WTF? I don't even want kids. I went back to sleep, but I never forgot how weird that was. Fast forward almost 10 years, and I'm pregnant for the first time. My coworker had given me a box full of baby boy clothes. I held onto them even though 2 different ultrasounds said I was having a girl. I wanted a girl. I had a pink baby shower, a girl's name picked out, all that stuff, but I still didn't get rid of that box of boy clothes. I remembered my weird half-asleep statement. 8 days before I was induced, I had another ultrasound to make sure the baby was doing okay. The first thing the tech said was, "They said you're having a girl?" That's funny, because here are his little boy parts. I cried in bed for 2 days straight, but the second I heard my son cry I fell in love with him. And I never doubted my gut again. When I was little, my parents were in the middle of divorcing, and my father would pick my sister and I up on Wednesday nights. We still lived in what passes for a rural town in Connecticut, and my father went to drop us off. But my mother wasn't home yet, so we were waiting in the driveway in the middle of the woods pretty much. The car had a sunroof, and I was seated in the back staring out at the stars when suddenly something I can't identify flew overhead. It was essentially a bunch of large circular lights grouped in a circle rotating. They seemed to be very large, traveling at a high rate of speed at a decent altitude. It went by quickly enough that I didn't even say anything to anyone in the car. Nearly 20 years later I was reclined on the couch watching some UFO show and they showed the exact thing I saw briefly. When they showed it I actually screamed and leapt to my feet. It took me a couple hours to calm down, it freaked me out so bad. Once, late one night, I had just finished showering. I'm in my bathroom drying off with my door open. As I'm daydreaming, I think I hear something in my living room, kitchen area. Which the living room is a few steps from where my bathroom is. Stopping to listen, I didn't hear anything else, so I thought it was my imagination and I went back to drying off. A few seconds later, I think I hear the noise again. This time being sure, I stopped, waited, and listened. When the noise started again. It took only a second or two to realize the noise sounded an awful lot like footsteps. Almost like someone wearing boots and scuffling their heel against the floor. Frozen in place, unsure of what to do, I waited and counted 9 footstep noises until it stopped. Right at the entrance of the hallway. Directly facing my bathroom and me. Whatever that noise was, it has never happened again all these years later. I've told this story before, but I'll retell it here because of how fucking creepy it is. I was at my grandmother's house staying the night. It was summer, probably mid-July, and there was a storm brewing outside. I was laying in bed, just listening to the TV as I tried to drift off to sleep when I suddenly felt like I was being watched. I laid there, trying to pull the covers up higher, the uncomfortable feeling growing stronger. The room was starting to grow cold. I tried to focus on the TV. I was watching something on Cartoon Network, so it definitely wasn't contributing to the creepy atmosphere welling up in the room. Then I felt something down by my foot. The bed depressed slightly and the covers fluttered. Then something icy cold grabbed my ankle. I immediately jumped out of bed and hit the light switch on the wall behind me. At the same time I ripped the covers off of the bed. There was nothing there, but I still felt the cold fingers around my ankle. About 2 months ago I made a phone call to my mother, but the line went dead after the first ring, and then it got fuzzy. For some reason I felt like I shouldn't put the phone down, and so I kept it at my ear. The fuzz sounded like TV static, and it got louder over about 15 seconds. Then a voice came on that was faint and robotic sounding. It may sound silly, but it sounded similar to the robotic-like voices in The Fourth Kind, with Mila Jovovich. The static was much louder than the voice, and made it very difficult to make out the words. This is what I could hear. You chose. Father. Home. Need. Heat. Child. Watching. Save. Safe. Then everything stopped except for a faint breathing sound. The hair on my body was standing and I was shocked. I almost put the phone down, but then I heard a loud exhale, and then the line went dead. Ever since then, I've been feeling like I'm being watched, and I've seen a dark figure multiple times in my house at night. A peer of mine were walking to the parking garage after work one night, and we were talking. I made a joke, she laughed, and when she turned to look at me, her face immediately turned to horror. She screamed and actually fell back. When I finally calmed her down, she said she swore she saw a skinny black figure walking beside me and looking at her. It had a large head and bright white eyes. She is still frightened from it. My sleep is interrupted every night by bright white lights that go away right when I open my eyes. I don't know what to make of it all. But I have a theory that this may be connected to something that happened to me as a child. Stepfather called home to say he was Illinois and headed home. He was a long-haul truck driver, so would call every night to say if headed back or picked up another load and would be headed to a new destination. Tells mom where he is and she tells us he won't be home for another 4 hours, so we might as well get ready for bed. He gets home in 2 hours while we are still up. She's confused and asks him how he made it home so fast. He tells her it wasn't fast, just took the normal route of roads. She still doesn't understand, as the bridge over the Wabash River he would have needed to take was out from a recent flood. Tells her it wasn't, and that is how he got home. Next closest bridge was an hour north from there, which is why she figured 4 hours to add the hour up then back down. We drive the next day to where the bridge was washed out to show Dad, as he insisted it wasn't out. His face turned white when he saw the bridge because it was too damaged. He could not have driven over it, but can only remember driving over it the evening before. Never did figure out how he got home that night, and this was almost 50 years ago. To start off, I am not religious now. When I was younger, however, I was raised Roman Catholic and had complete faith. I was around 10 years old, and I had a pet toad. I somehow lost it, and my mom was getting all anxious because reptiles creep her out. So, since I believed, I simply prayed for help to find the toad. Immediately a blueprint of my house popped up in my mind, like an X-ray vision of the house in blue, and a brightly highlighted area behind a dresser in my sister's room was standing out. Before I even checked there, I said, "I know where it is." There the toad was. I didn't think it was even strange until I considered it later on in life. I'll never forget this, and if my word means anything, I know, on the internet it doesn't. I swear on my kids it's 100% true. It was 2010, a few weeks before Christmas. My son was only 2 and was potty training, and had woken up in the night. I brought him to the bathroom and sat him on the toilet. My husband and I sat on the edge in the tub, facing our son. Suddenly he pointed behind us, into the shower, and screamed bloody murder. In that same instant, we very clearly heard what sounded like a 250 to 300 pounds man running down the staircase, which was only a few feet away from the bathroom door. We then heard violent pounding on the front door. It lasted at least a few minutes, although it felt like forever. It lasted long enough for me to come to my senses, kind of. We were still in shock. And I thought surely someone was trying to break into my home. It sounded like multiple large men trying to bust down my door. I was about to call the police when I realized my phone was downstairs, and I certainly wasn't going to go get it. The pounding stopped, and next we heard something just tearing our first floor of our house apart. It was frantic. It was like the Tasmanian devil was whirling around our living room and adjacent rooms, tearing shit up. Once that finally stops and all is quiet, my husband calls our dog, who was downstairs. A medium-sized pit bull who was not skittish and was so faithful that she always came when called. At this point we are still at the top of the stairs, only a few feet from our son who was on the toilet still, and the staircase bends, so we couldn't see downstairs. We hear her nails clicking on the hardwood, and suddenly scratching, as if she couldn't get her footing or something. She doesn't come. My husband calls her again, and finally she comes to us, clearly shaken. Eventually we get brave and go downstairs to see what we could make sense of. Something had to explain it, right? Downstairs our house is a wreck. The Christmas tree was knocked over, branches broken off. And from the bottom of the stairs to the top of the stairwell that leads to the basement is a line of dog pee. Now, this dog didn't have accidents in the house, and she didn't go in the basement, either. The only thing we could conclude was that she tried to come upstairs the first time we called her and was held down, causing the scratching sound of her trying to gain traction on the hardwood floor, and/or dragged toward the basement, causing her to pee out of sheer fear. We all slept together that night, and I sage cleansed the house the next day. We never had a problem there again, but I did find something strange in the basement after. What appeared to be dried straw or something similar, braided, tied with a red ribbon and hung on the wall. Never did find out what it was for. Scariest shit of my life. My dad was renovating the kitchen in his house before they moved out. We were putting new cabinets in. When we took out the old cabinets, 60-ish years old, behind the cabinet, inside the wall, we found a pair of white old-times children's shoes. What did we do? We threw those fuckers right in the trash. I guess this pissed off the baby ghost or spirit or whatever it was, cause ever since then we would hear knocks and children running throughout the house at odd hours of the night. And occasionally my baby sister's crib would be moved from my dad's room out into the hallway. We moved out a couple years ago and haven't been back. This happened to a friend of my dad's. My dad's friend used to drive a hearse van and he had to take a body one night to another city nearby. I don't remember which city, but it was in Arizona. It was quite a drive through the desert. At some point during the drive, he heard some quick breathing coming from the back of the hearse. Not wanting to look for fear of what was behind him, he continued toward the city while keeping his eyes straight forward. Finally, he pulled into a populated place and jumped out of the car, not even bothering to close the door. A few seconds later, a little puppy jumped out. Apparently, the puppy hitched a ride when he had stopped for gas before leaving on his trip. When I was younger, I was at a friend's birthday party. She used to always talk about how her room was haunted, aka the attic, but I never believed her. So we were all watching The Exorcist in her room and I was sitting on her bed the farthest back in the room you can go. If anyone moved I would have seen it. So behind me on her nightstand is an alarm clock. My mom was coming to pick me up and I have this terrible habit when I'm anticipating a certain time, I check the clock often. So I kept turning my head to check the time and after about the 5th time checking I turn around to check it again and the clock is turned around to face the wall. Now no one moved cause I would have seen it, so it wasn't just a friend messing with me. It was creepy and freaked me out, so went outside to wait for my mom. To this day it creeps me out. My best friend. Let's call him Gary. Gary isn't the type to make stuff up for laughs or attention. He's very down to earth, very level-headed. He grew up to be a prison guard, for fuck's sake. Gary used to work at a mental ward for the mentally insane. He had lots of stories about the crazies they're doing, saying weird shit all the time. One time he's over at my place after his graveyard shift, and he asks me to step outside to have a smoke with him, which isn't characteristic of Gary. Gary knows I don't smoke and I hate the smell, and usually he just steps out, smokes a quick one, then comes back inside when he's chilling out at my place. The look in his eyes I'll never forget. It was like I just told him he had cancer. He asks if I'm religious, at the time I was, and asks if he told me something really weird, if I would think he was crazy. No, of course not, Gary. What is this about? Did you get fired? Gary tells me about a mental patient at the ward we'll call Samson. Samson is what they at the mental ward call a shuffler. He gets to hang out in general population with the other usually non-violent crazies, but like most shufflers, doesn't really interact with anyone. He mostly just stares off into space, doped out on meds, or if he's not doped on meds, he shuffles around like he's constantly looking for something. Shufflers are people no one cares about, no one is looking for, and no one can fix. They're just wards of the state until they die, and can't operate on a basic human level to be trusted to take care of themselves. Tonight, while Gen Pop is being carted back the rooms for the night, Gary helps Samson to his room, as the guy was acting a bit more resistant than normal, and Gary is a big fella. The nurses wanted Gary to escort Samson to his room and get him settled down for his meds before he goes to sleep. Samson knows Gary, sees him every day. This time, though, as Gary gets close to Samson to take him to his room, Samson wants none of it. He's resistant, vulgar, and keeps saying, "Stay away," but not to Gary. Gary keeps asking why Samson doesn't want to go, why he's afraid all of a sudden. Samson looks Gary right in the face, something a shuffler usually can't or won't ever do, and says, "Look out behind you." Gary squints and turns around. Nothing there, just other people in the ward. Gary asks Samson what he means, but at that point, Samson had calmed down and returned to shuffler state. Gary gets Samson back to his room without incident. Now this kinda crazy shit happens all the time in the ward. Crazy people are broken people. They see things, hear things, and their reality isn't the same all the time. Gary just chalked up Samson's odd behavior to crazy, and didn't think anything of it. That night, he clocks out and walks out to his car. It's a balmy summer night, and often, windows would fog up on the inside rather than the outside. Gary locks his car every night, he tells me, because a few years ago someone got into his car and stole his head unit. Now he always locks his car. He gets to his car, unlocks it, and gets in. As he's backing out, he turns around to look out his back window. There's scrawled on the door inside the window, "Look out behind you." Gary flips his fucking shit, yells out and jumps out of his car, thinking maybe a crazy escaped and was hiding in his car. But there's nothing. No one in the car, no forced entry or broken windows. He wiped off his rear window and drove to my house without even going home. Honestly, I don't know what to think about the story. It's possible he could have made it up. It's possible someone could have picked the lock to his car, wrote the message, and maybe also convinced Samson to tell Gary the cryptic message. But it's just so incredibly unlikely. Samson is a shuffler. He literally can't put more than a couple words together. He's basically a walking vegetable on his meds. And what would Gary gain out of making up this story? We weren't trading ghost stories or anything. He wasn't religious, and I wasn't a major religious person he might have been fucking with either. It just doesn't make any sense. Gary doesn't do that stuff, and he's been my friend for over a decade. He's never done something like that prior, and has never done anything like that again. He had one other story revolving around that phrase, and it was completely different, at a completely different time in both our lives. I've also got some of his stories from other times he was working at the mental ward. Those crazy people say and do some pretty crazy things, go figure. I was playing in the backyard on my swing set. Maybe 8 years old or so. My mom's car was in the driveway, maybe 25 feet away from me. I see my grandma peek out from behind the car, like she was hiding behind it. I get off my swing, run to the car, and she's not there. I run in the house, assuming she must have went in, and asked my mom where grandma was. And my mom said she wasn't coming over today. I swear I saw her face peeking out from behind that car, clear as day. Second time, I was maybe 10 and shared a bedroom with my 3-year-old brother. Our room was a big square, set up so that the headboards of our beds were on opposite walls, with about 3 feet of space between the beds. In other words, if we both sat up in bed, we'd be looking directly across the room at each other. As I lay on my back in bed, the bedroom door is to my right about 8 feet away. To my left is the outside wall of the house, maybe 5 feet away. So I'm laying there, and suddenly I see an old man standing in front of the bedroom door. I don't have my glasses on, so I assume it's my dad. The man starts to walk down the middle of the room towards the beds, and right before he gets to us I notice that it's not my dad. It was an older man, and it looked like he was dressed in something similar to a monk's robe. He stared straight ahead at the outside wall, and continued to walk in between our beds. As he got further away, I couldn't see as well, and it appeared that he slowly vanished as he reached the outside wall. I was scared shitless, unable to move or speak. I buried myself under my blankets for the rest of the night. I never told my parents about it. My mother runs a sort of child care out of her home for 3 friends of hers who work and have young children. The oldest of these kids is nearing 3 years old. He's a very smart kid, and he's never been one to make things up or lie just for the sake of it. It was a few weeks ago, however, that he shouted loudly from the kitchen for my mother to come help him because there was a man in the adjacent laundry room staring at him. My mother came into the room and saw nothing, but the kid was terrified and shaking. She reassured him that no one was there after having checked around for herself. The day went on and the kid kept mentioning the man in the laundry room. The next day when he was dropped off, his mother said that the man was all he talked about at home that night. A few hours passed and the boy was standing in the kitchen looking for his drink. My mom hears him shriek in terror again, entering the room to find his eyes fixated on the same location as before, this time crying and telling her that the man was going to get him. We're still not totally sure what he saw, but he certainly saw something. The room he was looking into was totally empty, and only recently has he felt comfortable being anywhere near that room. No one else was in the house apart from my mother and the 3 children she was keeping. He was though and still is very adamant that the man in the laundry room wanted to take him. Happened to a friend I know. She's living alone in her apartment, and late one night she has a guy friend over. He sits on her bed when he suddenly decides he wants to eat tandoori chicken. It was 12 at night, so she was confused and said, "Can't we get some tomorrow?" He insists that they get some that night and pulled her out of her apartment without taking the keys. She got angry and said now they were stuck outside for the night when he tells her, "Call the cops, there is someone under your bed." Cops came, caught the guy. He was stalking her and had been hiding under her bed for God knows how much time.